The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as 17-year-old Marcus Thompson adjusted his expensive designer sunglasses and smirked at his reflection in his phone camera. His perfectly styled blonde hair caught the light as he posed for what must have been the 20th selfie of the day. Behind him, tourists gathered in respectful clusters, taking photos of the iconic red-coated guards who stood motionless at their posts. Marcus wasn't like the other tourists. His father owned a chain of luxury hotels across Europe, and Marcus had grown accustomed to getting whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. Private jets, exclusive parties, and VIP treatment were simply normal parts of his existence. Today's visit to London was supposed to be just another stop on his summer vacation before heading off to an elite boarding school in Switzerland. "This is so boring," Marcus complained loudly to his friend Jake, who was recording everything on his phone for their social media accounts. "These guys just stand there like statues. What's the point?" Jake, equally privileged but slightly more aware of social boundaries, shifted uncomfortably. "Dude, maybe we should just take some normal photos and move on. There are tons of other cool places to see." But Marcus was already walking closer to one of the guards, a tall man with sharp features and perfectly polished boots. The guard's red tunic was immaculate, his bearskin hat precisely positioned, and his rifle held at the perfect angle. His eyes stared straight ahead, showing no acknowledgement of the growing crowd of onlookers. "Hey, robot man!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Several tourists turned to look, some frowning at his disrespectful tone. "Can you even hear me in there? Or are you just completely brain-dead?" The guard remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. This only seemed to encourage Marcus, who pulled out his phone and started recording himself. "Check this out, followers," he said into the camera with a cocky grin. "I'm about to see if these toy soldiers are actually real people or just incredibly boring robots." He moved even closer to the guard, now standing just a few feet away. "Seriously, how much do they pay you to stand around and do absolutely nothing all day?" "My allowance is probably more than your yearly salary." A middle-aged British woman nearby whispered to her husband, "Someone should tell that young man to show some respect." Her husband nodded in agreement, but neither of them felt comfortable confronting the obviously entitled teenager. Marcus was just getting started. He had noticed that a small crowd was forming, and some people were recording the interaction with their phones. This was exactly the kind of attention he craved. Back home, his social media followers loved watching him push boundaries and get away with behavior that would get most people in serious trouble. "I bet you can't even move without asking your mommy for permission," Marcus continued, now circling the guard like a predator sizing up prey. "What happens if I do this?" He reached out as if to touch the guard's rifle, stopping just short, but making sure the gesture was clearly visible to all the onlookers. Jake grabbed his friend's arm. "Marcus, seriously, this isn't cool. Let's just go." But Marcus shrugged him off. "Relax, Jake. What's he going to do? These guys aren't allowed to move or speak or do anything interesting. They're like living mannequins." He turned back to the guard with renewed confidence. "Isn't that right, mannequin man? You just stand there and look pretty while real people live actual lives?" The crowd was growing larger now, and Marcus could see people pointing and talking among themselves. Some looked disgusted by his behavior, while others seemed fascinated by the spectacle. A few tourists had their phones out, clearly recording the entire encounter. "You know what I think?" Marcus announced to his growing audience, his voice getting louder and more theatrical. "I think these guards are just failed actors who couldn't make it in real entertainment, so now they have to pretend to be soldiers for tourists. It's actually pretty sad when you think about it." He stepped even closer to the guard, now close enough that he could have reached out and touched the man's uniform. "I mean, look at this costume. It's like something from a theme park. Do you have to practice standing still? Or does it just come naturally because you're already brain dead? The guard's eyes remained fixed on a point in the distance, his breathing so controlled that his chest barely moved. His hands held the rifle with unwavering steadiness, and not even the smallest muscle in his face twitched in response to Marcus's increasingly offensive comments. This apparent lack of reaction only fueled Marcus's determination to get some kind of response. In his privileged world, people always reacted to him, whether with admiration, fear, or anger. The idea that someone could simply ignore him was both infuriating and intriguing. "Maybe you really are deaf," Marcus said, now speaking directly into the guard's face from less than 2 feet away. "Or maybe you're just too stupid to understand what I'm saying. Is that it? Did they recruit you from some special needs program?" A gasp went up from several people in the crowd. Even Jake looked horrified at his friend's words. "Marcus, that's enough," Jake hissed, grabbing his friend's arm again. "You're being a complete jerk. Let's go before something bad happens." But Marcus was too caught up in his performance to listen to reason. The combination of attention from the crowd, the recording phones, and his own sense of invincibility had pushed him into a state where consequences seemed impossible. In his mind, he was untouchable. His father's money and influence had always protected him from any real repercussions for his actions. "I wonder what would happen if I just—" Marcus reached out toward the guard's hat, his fingers getting closer and closer to the perfectly positioned bearskin. The crowd held its breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The guard remained motionless, but something in his eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. It was such a subtle change that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Jake caught it and felt a chill run down his spine. "Marcus, don't," Jake whispered urgently. "I think you should really stop now." But Marcus was beyond listening. His hand moved closer to the guard, and his smile grew wider as he prepared to cross a line that should never be crossed. The moment Marcus's fingers made contact with the guard's bearskin hat, everything changed in an instant. What had been a perfectly still statue of a man suddenly transformed into a force of nature that moved with lightning speed and military precision. "Make way for the Queen's Guard!" The roar that came from the guard's throat was so powerful and unexpected that Marcus stumbled backward, his face going white with shock. The voice carried across the entire courtyard with the authority of someone who had spent years commanding respect on battlefields around the world. The guard stepped forward with a sharp, practiced movement, his rifle moving smoothly from its ceremonial position to a more assertive stance. His eyes, which had been staring into the distance just seconds before, now locked directly onto Marcus with an intensity that made the teenager feel as though he was being examined by a predator. "Step back immediately," the guard commanded, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "You will not touch the Queen's Guard or his equipment." Marcus's mouth fell open in complete surprise. For the first time in his life, someone had not only refused to be impressed by his wealth and attitude, but had actually challenged him with genuine authority. The transformation from silent statue to commanding presence was so dramatic that Marcus couldn't process what was happening. The crowd that had gathered to watch Marcus's disrespectful performance was now backing away rapidly, giving the guard plenty of space. Tourists who had been recording the encounter were still filming, but their expressions had changed from amusement or disgust to genuine concern for what might happen next. I was just," Marcus stammered, his usual confidence completely shattered. The designer sunglasses slipped from his face and clattered to the cobblestones as he continued stepping backward. "Silence!" the guard bellowed, taking another precise step forward. "You will listen and you will learn." Jake had gone completely pale and was tugging frantically at Marcus's sleeve, trying to pull his friend away from the increasingly tense situation. "Come on, man. Let's go right now," he whispered urgently. But the guard wasn't finished. This wasn't just about one disrespectful teenager. This was about everything the uniform represented, everything these men stood for, and the honor they protected every single day. "Do you have any idea who we are?" the guard demanded, his voice carrying a combination of pride, anger, and authority that made everyone within 50 yards stop and listen. "We are the Queen's Guard. We have served in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in places where real men fight real battles while spoiled children like you play with daddy's money." Marcus felt his legs trembling beneath him. Never in his 17 years had anyone spoken to him with such overwhelming authority. His father's employees were always polite and deferential. Teachers at his expensive private schools were careful never to offend parents who made large donations. Even police officers in the past had been respectful once they learned his family name. But this man was different. This man represented something bigger than money, bigger than social status, bigger than anything Marcus had ever encountered. "These uniforms have been worn by heroes," the guard continued, his voice never losing its power. "Men who died protecting freedom, men who sacrificed everything so that privileged little boys like you could stand here safely and make fools of themselves." The crowd was completely silent now, except for the sound of camera phones recording every word. Marcus could see people's faces in his peripheral vision, and none of them looked sympathetic to his situation. If anything, they seemed to be enjoying watching him get the comeuppance he so clearly deserved. "Sir, please," Marcus tried to say, his voice barely above a whisper, but the guard cut him off immediately. "You call me sir now?" the guard roared with obvious disdain. "Now that you realize you've bitten off more than you can chew? Where was that respect 5 minutes ago when you were calling me a robot and questioning my intelligence?" Marcus realized with growing horror that this man had heard every single insult, every disrespectful comment, every arrogant assumption. The guard had been perfectly aware of everything that was happening, but had maintained his professional composure right up until the moment Marcus had crossed the final line by actually touching him. "I didn't mean—" Marcus started again, but his words died in his throat under the guard's withering stare. "You didn't mean what?" the guard demanded. "You didn't mean to disrespect the crown? You didn't mean to insult men who have served their country with honor? You didn't mean to act like the spoiled, entitled brat that you clearly are?" By now, palace security officers were approaching from multiple directions, having been alerted by the commotion. But they maintained their distance, recognizing that their colleague was handling the situation with appropriate military discipline. "Look around you!" the guard commanded, and Marcus's eyes darted nervously at the crowd of tourists who were all staring at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. These people came here to show respect to a great institution, and instead they had to watch a child throw a tantrum because the world doesn't revolve around his daddy's bank account. Marcus could feel tears starting to form in his eyes, though whether from shame, fear, or sheer overwhelm, he couldn't tell. This was nothing like the carefully controlled world he was used to, where money could solve any problem and influence could smooth over any mistake. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I just want to leave." "Oh, now you want to leave?" The guard's voice carried a tone of bitter amusement. "Now that you've learned that actions have consequences? Now that you've discovered that not everyone in the world exists for your entertainment?" Jake was practically pulling on Marcus's arm now, desperate to get his friend away from the situation before it escalated any further. But the guard wasn't quite finished delivering his lesson. "Let me tell you something about real strength, young man," the guard continued, his voice slightly lower but no less intense. "Real strength isn't about money or showing off or making other people feel small. Real strength is about service, about honor, about standing for something bigger than yourself." Marcus nodded frantically, just wanting the confrontation to end. But he was about to learn that his humiliation was far from over. One of the approaching security officers had reached them and was speaking quietly into his radio. Marcus caught fragments of the conversation and felt his stomach drop as he heard words like incident report and embassy notification. The guard noticed Marcus's growing panic and allowed himself a grim smile of satisfaction. "Yes, that's right. There will be paperwork. There will be official reports. Your little performance here today won't just disappear because Daddy has a black card." For the first time in his life, Marcus understood that his actions might have consequences that money couldn't fix. The security officer finished his radio conversation and approached Marcus with professional efficiency. "Son, I'm going to need to see some identification, and we'll need to have a conversation about what just happened here." Marcus's hands shook as he fumbled for his wallet, the expensive leather suddenly feeling heavy in his trembling fingers. Behind him, he could hear the crowd beginning to disperse, but not before several tourists had clearly gotten good footage of his public humiliation. The thought of this ending up on social media made his stomach churn with a completely new kind of anxiety. "Marcus Thompson," he mumbled, handing over his passport. The security officer examined it carefully, noting his American nationality and the expensive hotel address stamped on recent entry documentation. "Mr. Thompson, you've committed a serious breach of protocol here today," the officer said calmly. "Touching a member of the Queen's Guard and disrupting the peace are not matters we take lightly. We'll need to contact the American embassy to inform them of this incident." The word embassy hit Marcus like a physical blow. His father had drilled into him throughout childhood that any legal trouble abroad could have serious consequences for the family's business dealings. International incidents, even minor ones, had a way of becoming major problems when you operated luxury hotels across multiple countries. Jake stepped forward nervously. "Officer, sir, can't we just apologize and move on? Marcus didn't really mean any harm. He's just young and stupid." The security officer's expression remained unchanging. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. This incident was witnessed by dozens of people and has likely been recorded by multiple tourists. The palace takes these matters very seriously, particularly given the current security climate." Meanwhile, the guard had returned to his post, but remained more alert than before. Marcus could feel the man's eyes on him occasionally, and each glance felt like a reminder of how completely he had misjudged the situation. The guard's powerful voice still echoed in his ears, along with the harsh truths about privilege and respect that no one in Marcus's life had ever dared to speak. 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself in a small office inside the palace complex, sitting across from a stern-faced woman in her 50s, who introduced herself as Chief Inspector Williams. The walls were lined with official photographs and certificates, creating an atmosphere of serious authority that made Marcus feel smaller with each passing minute. "Mr. Thompson," Inspector Williams began, consulting a file that seemed to have appeared remarkably quickly. "This isn't your first incident of disrespectful behavior, is it?" Marcus looked up in surprise. "What do you mean?" "We've been in contact with authorities in France and Switzerland. It seems you've had several run-ins with local police over the past year. Nothing serious enough for formal charges, but a pattern of entitled behavior that your father's influence has helped you avoid consequences for." The inspector's words hit Marcus like cold water. He had always assumed those incidents had been completely forgotten, swept under the rug by his father's money and connections. The idea that there was an actual record being kept was terrifying. "However," Inspector Williams continued, "this situation is different. You've interfered with a military guard in the performance of his duties in front of international witnesses on palace grounds. This creates diplomatic implications that go well beyond local police matters." Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. "What? What's going to happen to me?" The inspector leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "That depends largely on how you handle the next few days, Mr. Thompson. Your behavior today was disgraceful, but you're still a minor, and this is your first truly serious incident on British soil. She opened another folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. Here's what's going to happen. First, you're going to write a formal letter of apology to Guardsman Patterson, the man you insulted and assaulted today. And yes, touching someone without permission is considered assault under British law. Marcus's pen trembled as he took notes on everything she was telling him. Second, you're going to perform 40 hours of community service at a veterans rehabilitation center here in London. You'll work directly with soldiers who have been injured in combat, and you'll learn something about real sacrifice and service. The thought of spending time with actual wounded veterans made Marcus feel sick with shame as he remembered his casual insults about the guards' intelligence and worthiness. Third, you're going to attend educational sessions about British military history and the role of the ceremonial guards. You'll learn exactly what these men have done and what they represent, since you clearly have no understanding of either. Inspector Williams paused to let this sink in before continuing. If you complete all of these requirements satisfactorily, and if there are no further incidents during your remaining time in the UK, then this matter will be resolved without criminal charges. However, there will be a permanent record that will follow you for the rest of your life. Marcus nodded frantically, relieved that jail time wasn't being mentioned. But understand this, Mr. Thompson. The inspector's voice hardened. If you step out of line even once while you're completing these requirements, or if you ever behave this way again on British soil, you'll find that your father's money has much less influence than you've been led to believe. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the corridor of the St. B. George's Veterans Rehabilitation Center, wearing simple jeans and a plain t-shirt instead of his usual designer clothes. His manicured hands, once soft from a life of leisure, now showed calluses from helping wounded soldiers with physical therapy exercises and maintaining the facility's gardens. The experience had been unlike anything he had ever imagined. He had met men and women who had lost limbs, who suffered from traumatic brain injuries, who carried invisible scars from combat experiences that Marcus couldn't even comprehend. These people, who had every reason to be bitter and angry, had shown him more patience and kindness than he deserved. Staff Sergeant Morrison, a man who had lost his right leg to an IED in Afghanistan, had become an unlikely mentor during Marcus's community service. The thing about respect, Morrison had told him during one of their conversations, is that you can't buy it, and you can't demand it. You earn it through your actions, through how you treat other people when nobody's watching. Marcus had also learned about the guard he had insulted, Guardsman Patterson. The man was a decorated veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, had been awarded the Military Cross for Valor, and spent his off-duty time volunteering with homeless veterans. The contrast between Patterson's genuine heroism and Marcus's empty arrogance was so stark that it made Marcus physically uncomfortable to think about. On his final day of community service, Marcus was approached by Inspector Williams, who had come to evaluate his progress. "So, Mr. Thompson, what have you learned?" she asked. Marcus thought carefully before answering. For once in his life, he wanted to give an honest response rather than saying what he thought someone wanted to hear. "I learned that I was completely wrong about everything," he said quietly. "I thought money and status made me important, but I was just a spoiled kid who had never done anything meaningful with my life. Those guards, those veterans, they've actually served something bigger than themselves. I was so busy thinking I was better than everyone else that I never realized how small I actually was." Inspector Williams nodded approvingly. "And what will you do with this knowledge?" Marcus looked out the window at the garden where he had spent many hours working alongside men and women who had sacrificed so much for their countries. "I want to be different. I want to earn respect instead of expecting it. I want to do something that matters." 6 months later, Marcus was back home in America, but he was not the same person who had left for Europe that summer. He had transferred from his exclusive private school to a public school where he tutored younger students struggling with academics. He had started volunteering at a local veterans center using skills he had learned during his time in London. Most importantly, he had begun the long process of apologizing to all the people he had treated poorly throughout his life. It was humbling work, and many people were skeptical of his sincerity at first, but Marcus was determined to prove that his change was real. The video of his encounter with Guardsman Patterson had indeed gone viral, but not in the way Marcus had originally hoped. Instead of making him famous for being outrageous, it had made him infamous as an example of entitled behavior. The comments were brutal, and Marcus had to learn to live with the knowledge that millions of people had seen him at his absolute worst. But in an unexpected way, this public humiliation had become a gift. It was impossible for him to slip back into his old patterns of behavior when so many people were watching to see if he had really changed. The accountability was uncomfortable but necessary. 2 years later, Marcus received a letter that would change his perspective even further. It was from Guardsman Patterson himself, who had heard about Marcus's community service work and wanted to acknowledge the young man's efforts to make amends for his past behavior. "True strength," Patterson wrote, "is not about never falling down. It's about getting back up and becoming better than you were before. You've shown that kind of strength, and I respect that." Marcus framed that letter and kept it on his desk as a reminder that respect, once lost, could be earned back through consistent actions and genuine change. It had taken a Royal Guard's shocking response to wake him up, but Marcus was grateful every day for the lesson that had changed his life forever.